Now, does positive corporate news actually signal a clear for investors? Should they go out and buy stocks? Well, my next guest says that you've got to think internationally and also look for some hidden opportunities. Easier said than done, of course. Jack Caffrey, portfolio manager, equity strategist at JPMorgan Private Bank. He helps manage over $700 billion in assets. Jack, good to have you with us on Bloomberg. Thanks so much for coming in. So this idea of learning to live internationally, to understand that the world is no longer just the United States for investors. How do you train investors to look overseas?
Well, you can think about it in two different ways. The easier way, ultimately, I think, and the way we've been looking at it right now, is looking at the multinationals. Effectively, you can think of it as taking baby steps, but ultimately you wind up getting exposure to the non-dollar revenues, non-dollar cost streams of the U.S. multinationals. But at the same time, you can actually have companies that people have heard of, they understand. You get the liquidity and the transparency of the U.S. markets. Longer term, though, we're going to see people shifting what they think of their benchmark, their references. They'll think more in terms of the MSCI indices, perhaps, than the S&P, and actually owning international equities directly.
Does that become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that if you use these new indices, not necessarily new, but new if you're using them?
New to you, perhaps.
Exactly. The MSCI World Index, for example, if you use those as a reference point, then people start to follow them, and it becomes, well, self-fulfilling because people say, all right, I've got to be invested in those same companies.
Ultimately, at some point, you always have to have a bit of a ask yourself, does the index make sense? Does the weight in the index make sense? Because you would have thought about 1989, you might have had a massive Japan exposure. So ultimately, the index tells you where markets are becoming more relevant. And even when you think about the MSCI, there's always a float component there as well, as not just market cap, but float adjusted. So ultimately, there's going to be some thought about how you look and approach where you're going to make your allocations. But it's certainly an important step.
All right. Now, you also, Jack, you also mentioned that investors need to look for things that have been overlooked, things that are hidden. Now, of course, that's also very easy to say. It's much more difficult to do, at least consistently. What kinds of industry groups are we talking about?
Sure. I mean, what we'd like to think about is we're trying to embrace the unloved. So we're looking for stocks, we're looking for industries that investors would turn around and say, for example, it doesn't make sense anymore. The world has changed. So there are parts of technology where I think that's certainly very much true. There are parts of the industrial sector where that's very much true. And you can think about that from an intermediate, longer-term perspective. In some cases, it's just a function of looking at, what have investors just thrown out over the last 2 or 3 weeks when you saw perhaps a bit of a shortage of corporate news coming out, but you were seeing the economic data, which has consistently come in a bit worse than analysts have been forecasting. And
we had the GDP report, 1.8%.
Initial jobless claims coming in a little bit higher than expected.
Goods orders, yeah.
They still point to growth, but they don't point to growth that was quite as robust as analysts were thinking 2 or 3 months ago. And what you looked at over the last few weeks were certainly the cyclical sectors, the materials, the energy names, more or less being abandoned. So you have to decide, am I going to trade, am I going to invest? And then a lot of art, there's some science to it. I won't claim it's easy, because if it was easy, well, it wouldn't be a work.
You'd be on the beach somewhere. I want to thank you very much. Jack Caffrey joining us from JPMorgan Private Bank. Thanks for your insights.